Do you remember the 1960s through a filter of pop music and bright colours? That decade is sold to us as a cultural revolution, a time of liberation. But for the majority of people in Britain, it was a period defined by a much grimmer reality. The constant, low-level fear that the world around you could cause direct physical harm. This isn't a story about the fashion of Carnaby Street. It's the story of a nation where the human body itself was dangerously and routinely at risk. The air that choked you. In 1960s Britain, the simple act of breathing could be a lethal gamble. The nation's industrial cities were still regularly suffocated by smogs, a toxic blend of coal smoke and fog. The Clean Air Act of 1956 was supposed to have fixed this, but its rollout was slow, and it failed to control key pollutants like sulfur dioxide. The consequences were deadly. In December 1962, a dense smog settled over London, and in the space of a few days, it is estimated to have caused up to 700 deaths. Visibility dropped so low that flights were cancelled, while the air grew thick with a sulphurous stench. Hospitals filled with patients suffering from bronchitis, and citizens were advised to stay indoors or wear makeshift masks if they had to venture out. This was not a singular catastrophe. It was a recurring feature of urban life. The public response was often one of grim endurance, a sign that a lethal environment had become a normalized cost of living in an industrial society. Beyond the visible threat of smog, an invisible poison filled the air of every town and city. Every car on the road ran on leaded petrol. To improve engine performance, fuel was mixed with tetraethyl lead, a compound that released fine particles of a known neurotoxin into the atmosphere. While the devastating developmental effects on children would not be fully understood for decades, the immediate sensory impact was inescapable. The acrid smell of exhaust fumes was a constant feature of the urban landscape. This daily, low-level poisoning of the entire population stands as one of the great unlamented hazards of the era, a threat so pervasive it was simply the smell of normal life. The idea that the air itself should not be an active threat to your health was a standard we had not yet learned to expect. The job that crippled you. If the air outside was dangerous, the workplace was often worse. In the mines, factories, and shipyards that powered the nation, a silent epidemic of industrial disease was destroying working-class communities from the inside out. For Britain's coal miners, long days spent in clouds of coal dust led to a chronic and fatal lung condition. Coal workers' pneumoconiosis, better known as black lung. Throughout the 1960s, this disease was officially killing over 1,000 men a year, a figure widely believed to be a significant underestimate. These were not accidental deaths. They were the slow, attritional, and entirely predictable result of daily exposure. In construction and manufacturing, the miracle material of the age was asbestos. It was everywhere, used casually by workers who were given no protective gear and no warning of its latent dangers. They handled asbestos sheets with their bare hands, unaware that the dust they were breathing was a time bomb that could lead to mesothelioma and asbestosis decades later. While a sudden tragedy like the Aberfan disaster of 1966 could capture national attention, This far greater creeping death toll was largely accepted as a routine part of the job. Beyond these slow-motion killers, the risk of sudden violent injury was appallingly high. The entire culture of workplace safety was shockingly lax. In high-risk industries like construction, basic equipment was often ignored. One personal account from the time recalls that when a delivery of safety helmets arrived on a building site, the workers simply used them as buckets to hold nails. The statistics reflect this indifference. In 1965, about 1 in every 31 construction workers suffered an injury serious enough to require at least 3 days off work. By 1969, the situation had worsened to 1 in 27. The legal concept of an employer's duty of care was still in its infancy. It would take the landmark Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974 to establish the comprehensive regulations that are now standard. The 1960s workplace was a world where the risk of being maimed or killed by powerful machinery was a daily reality, and where the societal framework simply allowed such widespread harm to be treated as an acceptable cost of doing business. The home that harmed you. The home is meant to be a sanctuary, but for millions in 1960s Britain, it was another source of hardship and risk. Despite a post-war building boom, a vast portion of the nation's housing stock was decrepit. A 1967 housing survey of England and Wales delivered a shocking verdict. 11.7% of all dwellings were officially classified as unfit for human habitation. This statistic translated into a daily life of grinding difficulty. For many working-class families, the home was a place with no indoor toilet. Instead, they relied on an outhouse, often shared with neighbouring households, forcing a cold walk into the back garden in all weathers. Inside the house, the absence of a proper bathroom meant bathing was a weekly ritual conducted in a tin bath. This would be placed in front of the main fire for warmth, and the whole family would use the same water, which had to be heated, pan by pan, on the stove. Overcrowding was rampant. Personal accounts from the time describe 5 children having to share a single bed, sleeping in rooms where mildew ran down the walls. This was the persistence of Victorian-era living conditions into the decade of the space race. The contrast between the futuristic promise of the swinging 60s and the material reality for so many provides a stark rebuttal to the myth of universal post-war affluence. For those living in these conditions, modernity was something happening elsewhere, to other people. The daily struggle was not for cultural expression, but for basic levels of sanitation and warmth that are now considered a fundamental human right. The school that beat you. Even for children, supposedly safe spaces could be sites of institutionalized violence. Throughout the 1960s, the school day for many was punctuated by the threat and reality of corporal punishment, legally sanctioned and routinely practiced. Under the doctrine of in loco parentis, the state gave teachers the power to inflict physical pain as a method of discipline. The instruments of this system were universally feared. In England and Wales, the primary tool was the cane, used to deliver a set number of strokes for offences that could range from serious misbehaviour to simply talking in class. In Scotland, the weapon of choice was the tawse, a heavy leather strap, often with a split end, which was brought down hard on the palm of a child's hand. Personal accounts from the era describe a daily occurrence of canings and beatings with rulers, creating a toxic climate of fear and humiliation that permeated school life. This system was more than just a crude disciplinary measure. It was a physical reinforcement of the rigid social hierarchies of the time. The unquestioned authority of a teacher to inflict pain was a microcosm of broader power structures based on age and status. The practice was also deeply gendered, with boys being the target of physical punishment far more frequently and severely than girls. While the 1967 Plowden Report recommended its abolition in primary schools, the practice was so entrenched that it took until 1987 for corporal punishment to be finally outlawed in all state schools. The fact that state-sanctioned beatings were a feature of a child's education for so long is a jarring reminder of a profoundly authoritarian model of childhood that has thankfully vanished. The laws that controlled you. Ultimately, the greatest power over the human body belonged to the state itself, through laws that controlled life, death, and personal autonomy. Before 1967, abortion was illegal in the United Kingdom under an act passed in 1861. The only exception was to save the life of the mother. This forced thousands of women each year into the terrifying world of dangerous and often fatal backstreet abortions. The immense social stigma and legal peril surrounding unwanted pregnancy created a desperate public health crisis that was largely hidden from public view. The Abortion Act of 1967 was a landmark reform, but it did not grant women full control. Instead, it created a set of legal exemptions, making abortion permissible if two doctors agreed it was necessary. The final decision was placed in the hands of the medical profession, not the woman herself, a pragmatic compromise that revealed a society still unwilling to grant full reproductive sovereignty. At the same time, the state held the ultimate power, the right to end a citizen's life. At the dawn of the 1960s, capital punishment for murder remained a legal and practiced reality. However, public faith in the system was crumbling, largely due to a series of controversial executions in the previous decade. Cases like that of Timothy Evans, executed in 1950 and granted a posthumous pardon 16 years later, had exposed the irreversible fallibility of the justice system. This growing unease led to a two-stage abolition. The final executions in Britain took place in August 1964. Following this, the murder, abolition of death penalty. Act of 1965 suspended the practice for a 5-year trial period. This suspension was severely tested by public outrage following the Moors murders, which led to widespread calls for reinstatement. Yet, in December 1969, the House of Commons voted decisively to make the abolition permanent. This final act demonstrated a fundamental shift. The debate was no longer just about retribution, but about the moral authority and fallibility of the state itself, a conviction that proved strong enough to withstand immense public pressure. These weren't just isolated problems. They were interconnected parts of a society that placed a lower value on individual safety and autonomy than we do today. Progress, it turns out, is not always about what we invent. Sometimes It is measured by the dangers we decide we no longer have to tolerate. The greatest advancements of that era were not just in science or culture, but in the slow, difficult work of abolishing the conditions that put the human body at risk. If you have any memories of these discarded realities, please share them below. And for more journeys into Britain's past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.